I get it. Sam Raimi is huge in the canon when it comes to practical effects. When I sat down and decided to make my list of 100 essential practical effects films, I really wanted to think about the films that called to me. You know, I went to graduate school and I studied film theory, aware of the canon, what academics say about films and filmmaking and the history of film. I really wanted to approach my curation with an intersectional lens. Sam Raimi knows why I didn't include his film in my list. And everyone else who knows the canon probably knows why too. It's the tree scene. I remember the tree scene when I first saw this film. It was probably in the late 90s when I was super into indie film, and there were still VHS and there were still video stores around. And I just remember kind of feeling really traumatized by that scene, especially because his work is so slapstick. It really wasn't funny. And I know that he has also since said, and I think pretty soon after, that he did have regret on how he approached women in that film and how he treated women in that scene. And I just remember having a really ick taste in my mouth about that scene, both as a woman, as an SA survivor, as someone who loves the forest. I really have a hard time believing a tree would do that to a woman. There is no way in the world a tree would ever do that. When I think about the films in my list, I wanted them to be films that I would recommend to people. And I wouldn't recommend Evil Dead. I didn't like that scene. I understand that Sam Raimi has regrets about how he approached that work, and I get that. And there are plenty of lists about practical effects that are going to include Evil Dead, that are going to include Sam Raimi's work. My list, my obscure intersectional indie list, doesn't have to be one that uplifts his work. He's had plenty of work and, a long career. I will say, fast forward 30 plus years later, that I did really enjoy Send Help with Rachel McAdams. I thought she did an incredible job, and I will say that that is how you present a woman in a horror movie in the trees fighting for her life. So, well done. That's how you transform. I know there's a lot of exploitative cinema, and I've watched a lot of it, and maybe more than I wish I have watched. I think there's a thing with being a woman who loves film, especially if you went to school to study it, where you want to challenge yourself to watch all the things. And I remember myself in graduate school watching films that now I look back and I wish I hadn't watched them, but I was trying to keep up with the boys, film bros, so to speak. And I'm more sensitive now. But even then, even when I wasn't as sensitive, even when it was the late 90s and I would watch anything, I didn't like that scene. I didn't appreciate it. When I heard about the background production context as well as how that scene was made, and the violation it felt like it was, that even more felt to me like something that I wanted to omit from my lineup. I'm like, do you really want to omit Sam Raimi from your practical effects film list? What will film bros say? And so that was just more of a reminder to me, is I'm not doing this for the canon. I'm not doing this for academia. I'm doing this for me and for people like me who have diverse tastes, who like things that are obscure and independent, and also like some studio mainstream things, So my list includes all of the films that I feel like influenced me so much when I was growing up, that made me love cinema and that made me the storyteller that I am today and growing into every day, all stems back from that influence, that original influence in the 80s and 90s, when practical effects filmmaking was so different from what it is today. So you have to remember, practical effects means so many things. It's not just the blood and the gore type of special effects. It's not just the puppetry or the animatronics. It also includes things like shooting on location, in-camera film tricks. That's another practical effects. methods. So there's so many subtle details that could be considered practical effects. And then I think in the 80s and 90s, they were doing all of the things. And that was super impactful to the storytelling and to this just very visceral experience that you get when you watch these films. And so when I sat down to make my list, anything that was going to give me a negative vibe, a negative feeling, was not going to be included in that. And there are some problematic films in my list, you know, from the 1980s and 1990s, and in filmmaking in general, even today. There's a lot of problematic themes, language, storylines that sometimes we look back with nostalgia, and, you know, we have to really take into account the time and what was going on and how we saw things as acceptable that really today would not be acceptable. For me, I approach it as an archivalist, not someone that can make corrections. I know that the nostalgic side of me that grew up watching a lot of this filmmaking, I don't want to erase my experience through my child eyes that watch something because I know today that there's problematic themes. I think that we can discuss the films critically. I think you can choose whether you want to uplift a work or not. And sometimes we change our minds. You know, there's some films where I definitely looked into, are there any problematic histories in the directors that I featured? But for the most part, if there is some problematic issues, it doesn't necessarily take the film out of the running of its contributions to practical effects. There's another film, and also there were some kind of controversial elements to that film. I didn't remember it as viscerally as I remembered Evil Dead. So I feel like that was one of the reasons that I kept it in. But there's something along the lines of like a woman being assaulted and that like bringing her around to wanting to date or something. But I felt like there was more positive than negative on that one. I also took into account it being a foreign film. I actually made a director's key where I looked at if a film was made by a woman, made by a person of color, made by a black director, or made by a queer director. It's really important to consider intersectionality in curation. I find, as someone who loves practical effects from the 1980s and 1990s, that oftentimes those do tend to lead towards films made by white cis hetero men. And while they did some amazing canonical work, and I appreciate that, there also were other people who didn't get as much attention. And so I like to shine a light on those films and on those directors. I made my 100 essential practical effects films list. I wanted to think about the films that appealed to me and to other folks that identify similarly to me. And I think that oftentimes our voices and our perspectives get left off the table. Or perhaps maybe like one of our identities are considered. And so I made a key that kind of showcased this. And while only 25% of the directors in my list are from these inclusive communities, I think that statistic in itself kind of showcases the challenge that we face in still diversifying filmmaking today, and also in our archival process when we look back. To call out the directors in my 100 list that are these inclusive directors and people. So just to highlight as you're looking through the list, who's missing or how few people there are included. Filmmaking can be notoriously who you know, and so that's one of the reasons that the network is so small and tight and hard to break into, and it was in the 80s and 90s, and I mean it still is today, although there's the actual recruitment to try to include diverse voices. I think we come back to that question of diversity, where it's not just who's in front of the camera that needs to be diverse, but who's behind the camera as well, who's writing, who's directing, who's producing. All of these roles matter as far as inclusivity, and intersectionality is another really important aspect. So it's not just enough to pick one identity and hire and say that you've covered your bases. It's like, who are the people that, you know, cross various identities and experiences, and how particular their lens and their storytelling is. And there's a lot, you know, there's disability, there's neurodivergence, there's gender, there's sexuality, there's race, there's culture, there's class, there's education, you know, you could go on and on. There's geography, and there's style, and there's aesthetic too. So just like diversity is important in front of the camera and behind the camera, it's also important in our archival process, in who is documenting the history of our films and our media making, and what critical intersectional lenses are approaching curation, and who gets to decide what's valuable and what's important and what matters. We need diverse lenses in that process as well. And so I do that independently on my own as my creative practice. I really enjoyed making my 100 essential practical effects film list. There's 100 films from 1980 to 1995, and I'm going to be making a late 90s version. Things shifted. There was a lot more hybrid CGI digital effects, so I think I'm going to do a special list from like 95 to 2000. But I thoroughly enjoyed revisiting these films when I started to work on my creative practice as a writer again after taking somewhat of a hiatus, and I was trying to come back to it. I realized how influential cinema and filmmaking has been to me and in my life, and what a strong special interest of mine that it is, and it's always been one of those constants where I've always been a writer and I've always been a lover of movies. So it was really fun to put those things together recently, and I look forward to seeing what my next project is going to entail.